Stranger Things is a fantasy horror story set in a small town in 1980s America. A government experiment based on drugging people produces a young girl with magical powers who opens a portal to an alternate dimension. Monsters begin to spread through the town from this alternate dimension, and the girl ends up closing the portal. Of course, it is far more expensive to set a show in the past, so why was the 1980s chosen? First of all, in order to have shadowy monsters and missing people, you cannot have a population armed with cell phones. However, I would also argue that since the entire story is an allegory for mass immigration, the setting of the 1980s is not accidental. For Darwinian evolution to work, genes must have in-group preferences. You must prefer your own children to the children of strangers, and you must prefer your own tribe to alien tribes. Personality is largely genetic, which means that different tribes develop and enhance different personality traits. These tribes can live together in relative peace under two conditions. First, there must be economic freedom, which means that individual tribes cannot use the power of the state to rob and dominate other tribes and enrich themselves. Second, the dominant culture must promote and reinforce objective reason and evidence. The first condition means that tribes must learn to negotiate with each other rather than use identity politics to rob each other. The second condition means that the more irrational excesses of tribal cultures are sanded down by continual exposure to rational philosophy. Neither of those conditions are present in the modern West. There is no separation of state and economics, which means that various groups are currently engaged in a form of political civil war, just as religious groups were when there was no separation of state and church. Radical Marxist, postmodernist relativism and subjectivism have destroyed the cultural value of objectivity and rationality, which creates a fetid breeding ground for escalating tribal conflicts. In Stranger Things, a government program opens up a portal to another dimension called the Upside Down. The actual government program called MKUltra peaked in the 1960s, which was also the decade that saw the initial opening of Western countries to endless waves of third world immigration. In the story, a government scientist convinces a young girl named 11 to not run from the dangers she sees in the Upside Down, but rather to approach and touch them. This opens up a portal through which the monsters pour. Please understand, I'm not saying that everyone from the third world is a monster. I'm just talking about subjective fears and perceptions. This modern hippy-dippy subjectivist mantra that you should approach your fears, confront your fears, overcome your fears, that fear only exists in the mind, not in objective reality, is truly civilization endangering rampant nonsense. You do not run towards a tiger in the jungle in order to overcome your fears of tigers in the jungle. Sometimes your fears exist for a damn good reason. Only when our healthy fears of the natural world have been suppressed by the modern protections of cities and civilization do we end up with the bizarre idea that all fears are somehow irrational paranoia. Third world migration is causing significant problems in Western countries. Concern is not paranoia. When the girl listens to her corrupt papa and approaches the monster, touching it, the portal is opened. The same lie is also told to the boy, Will, who is terrified of a shadowy alien, but his mother's boyfriend tells him to stop avoiding the alien, which results in Will being infested and infected with an alien consciousness. He literally loses his will and turns on his friends. This is basic Marxist social justice warrior indoctrination, which denies free will for the sake of economic or tribal determinism. Do not be scared of the other, say the socialist educators who would rather riot than hire someone who was not a socialist. After the girl ignores her fears and opens the portal, the aliens start infiltrating the town. But it is very subtle and hard to see at first, just as mass immigration produces effects that are very subtle and hard to see at first. The aliens come to America for its resources, just as illegals and immigrants come to America these days, mostly for its taxpayer-funded resources rather than its freedoms. The aliens take and hunt Will, the son of a single mother, just as the immigrant rape gangs in England and other places take and hunt children. The lack of a father figure in the household creates a vulnerability for the child, since the children of single mothers are 30 times more likely to be abused by a man in the house. Also, the introduction of the welfare state gave rise to the destructive phenomenon of single motherhood, which in turn drives the demand for more and more welfare programs, the welfare programs that are used by legal and illegal immigrants at the expense of the domestic population. In Stranger Things, when the aliens enter America, they do not assimilate. Rather, they turn parts of the town into the environment they came from. This fear that there is a hard-to-see invasion combined with a complete lack of interest in assimilation is a deep modern anxiety that has significant empirical evidence. How do the aliens come in? They come through walls and tunnels. You understand how obvious this is, right? The aliens can walk through walls. There is no border. And they build tunnels. In the tunnels, there are bodies and diseases. This is the death count of aliens crossing borders and the fact that they bring diseases with them. Stranger Things is primarily a children's story. Most of the adults are oblivious to the dangers growing around them. This is because changing demographics affect children far more than adults. The boomers in the story do not really care about the aliens, just as boomers tend not to care about demographic replacement, because they have been told that immigration is necessary to pay for their own pensions, and so they are willing to sell off their culture in return for a handful of fiat currency, just as they were willing to sell off the future of their children through national debts in return for endless government programs and promises. It is important to remember that the problem is not the aliens. The problem is the government. It was the government who was experimenting on the young and using them to advance its own agenda, a clear analogy for national debts and the modern hellscape of government schools. The government opened the portal of endless immigration, and the government is unable to close it because admitting their errors would cause problems for politicians. In a fascinating subplot, a balding, bearded paranoia merchant thinks that the great danger to America is coming from Russia, and fears of Russia continually erupt in the dialogue. The girl 11 is a Russian agent, and Russians are infiltrating America, and so on. As it turns out, the real danger is coming from the American government rather than Russians on the other side of the world. I'm sure I do not need to break down this parallel any further. My Russia bot stole the election. The girl 11 has extraordinary powers, but lacks social skills. She has the ability to peer not just into other dimensions, but also into the future, which gives her great anxiety. She was raised by the government, but escaped. 11 represents the alternative media in the modern world. Most intellectuals are, in a very real way, kidnapped by the state and its allies. They are offered cushy tenured professorships, positions in think tanks, well-paid public roles in the media. Endless goodies await those who subjugate their mental powers to the demands and dictates of those in charge. 11 rejects being provided for and thus enslaved by the state. She knows the truth about the evils of government, as well as this other dimension, the upside down, and has the power to close the portal. I'm not saying that 11 is Ann Coulter, but I'm not saying she isn't either. 11 bonds with a boy, which provides her the emotional fuel to protect their world. The current European leaders are largely childless. They have little bond with the next generation, thus little incentive to protect their own culture and demographics. The girl, 11, is first hidden by the children, and then protected by a gruff and vaguely simian police officer named Hopper, no relation to Hans Hermann Hoppe. This has been the path of the alternative media. Those who first see the dangers support the new fledgling media, just as the children protect and feed 11. And then the police must protect the free speech of modern intellectuals, who can, with their powers, close the portal. The police and honest intellectuals may seem like unlikely allies, but it is the police who must deal with the increasing violence in various immigrant communities, and so the police have a natural incentive, even if just for the reasons of personal safety, to ally with and protect the honest individuals, talking about the dangers of mass immigration, who can in turn control the flow and protect the police. Even dangerous refugees show up in Stranger Things, in the form of a very cute, tiny, pretend lizard named Dart. When he first shows up, he is helpless and dependent. Later, he escapes his cage, eats a cat, and attacks anything that moves. This is analogous to radical Islamic terrorist groups who embed fighters in the refugee flow. These statistics are also very clear that the second generation of Muslims in Europe are far more radicalized than the first generation. Stranger Things is set in America, which is mainly dealing with the 20 to 30 million illegal aliens from Mexico. This has created a shadow society within America, just like the no-go zones in Europe, which parallels the alien world that intersects with and overlaps our own.